it does start, with he does have an affection for Vladimir Putin, and he does believe Putin when Putin says nice things to him. And he has an advisor named Steve Witkoff, who is effectively in Putin's pocket. Look, when Steve Witkoff, the real estate developer and supposed envoy, says in an interview, and he said this, 3 weeks ago, Vladimir Putin is candid and honest with me. Vladimir Putin, candid and honest, the guy who invaded another country, the guy who has tried to destabilize Europe, destabilize the US, and he's candid and honest with you. Well, if Steve Witkoff tells that to Trump, Trump goes, oh, I guess everything's okay with Vlad.
Joining us today, Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute. Welcome back to our program, Professor Lucas.
Good afternoon, Daniel. Good afternoon, Ukraine.
Thanks for being with us today. Ukraine has sent interceptor drones and military experts to the Middle East, to Jordan, to help protect U.S. military sites in Jordan, according to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. From your perspective, could this give Ukraine any kind of leverage with President Donald Trump?
Well, I think, first of all, Daniel, it's a marker of, that as we're in this fifth year of Russia's invasion, still where Ukraine is as a power, that it could actually be amongst the leaders now in anti-drone technology, and can send specialists out, even when you need some specialists, obviously, back in Ukraine to defend against the Russians. But I think beyond that, you're looking at a political calculation that I'm sure Ukraine President Zelensky is making. He's pretty much said this openly, which is, all right, if we give the U.S. and countries linked to the U.S., like the Gulf states, support in their defense against Iran's missiles and drones, that will make them think highly of us, and they will provide political and military support that we need in terms of our air defenses and in terms of our negotiations with the Russians. Now, how much that will work with the Trump folks, that's a bit trickier to say, because there's a practical issue here, which is that, the U.S. has expended a lot of its air defense capability helping countries in the Middle East, not just simply Jordan, but, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, and of course, Israel. And indeed, it has been a line of the U.S. military going into this conflict with Iran, that if this was a protracted conflict, the U.S. would face a shortage of its own interceptors to intercept drones and missiles. So I'm not sure how much the U.S. has to be able to help Ukraine. And then secondly, there are certain people in the Trump administration that have used the excuse of limited American stocks to say, we have to keep everything for ourselves. This is why we can't help Ukraine as we pursue our own initiatives. And one of those people is Elbridge Colby, the Assistant Secretary of Defense. So I'm not sure this is going to lead to a boost directly from the U.S. for Ukraine air defenses, but I think it may lead to goodwill for Ukraine on the political side, which includes, for example, that ongoing issue of, how do you defend against Russians in the short term, with Europe also providing support, the international community providing support, but then also what type of security guarantees do you have? And this has always been a question of, how much will the U.S. commit itself to those security guarantees? And clearly, if Ukraine is showing itself a reliable ally, then you think Washington will be much better inclined. I mean, just to put it into terms that I think President Zelensky has also expressed, look, NATO will not become a member of NATO. NATO will not become a member of NATO in the near future, but Ukraine is acting like a NATO member. It's acting like a country that fulfills that commitment to Article 5 of NATO, to collective defense. So even if Ukraine does not become a member of NATO in the future, shouldn't you give Ukraine that same standing? Especially if the Russians threaten another invasion.
Also, meanwhile, Russia is providing Iran with targeting information to help Tehran to attack US soldiers in the Middle East, according to the Washington Post. What is your assessment of this dramatic development in cooperation between Iran and Russia?
Yeah, I still don't have confirmation of this, from sources that I look at, but certainly U.S. officials went to the Washington Post and put this out there and said, yeah, Russia's helping the Iranians when it comes to the positions of American warplanes, the positions of American warships, possibly the positions of American troops. And let's put it this way, that no one's come out with a denial of that report. Instead, over the weekend on the political talk shows in the United States, you had this bizarre spectacle of Trump administration officials saying, oh, this story really isn't that important. The White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said, oh, we're dealing with this conflict. This isn't really something to be concerned about. Then you had Donald Trump literally shout at a reporter, ask me another question. Don't ask me this one. And it was like, okay, wait a minute, guys. Any normal administration would say that even the possibility that the Russians are providing intelligence that could get your troops killed, that could at least affect your operations against Iran, you should treat that as a hostile act. But instead, the Trump people over the weekend were more concerned with justifying the lifting of sanctions on Russian oil with the 30-day waiver to India, and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent saying we might allow others we might lift the sanctions on other countries as well. So I just find the Trump administration in really this bizarre place where they no longer want to deal with reality. They want to construct a scenario which is that the war against Iran is going well. We don't want to take sides over Russia's invasion of Ukraine because somehow we still think we can get a settlement there and we don't want to upset the Kremlin. So we're not going to call them out for this, which means, you asked about leverage earlier. The leverage that you got here is the Russians have got leverage on the Trump folks. They shouldn't, but as long as the Trump people don't want to upset the Kremlin, yeah, Russia can absolutely give assistance to the Iranians, albeit in these fairly discreet ways. I mean, it wasn't like they announced that this was taking place. And until you get someone in the Trump camp that has the backbone to say, no, look, this is unacceptable. We can still try to mediate Russia and Ukraine in the talks, but we have to call Moscow out from helping the country that we are at war with.
From your perspective, why is President Trump so irritated with this information about possible intelligence sharing between Moscow and Tehran?
Because he doesn't want to be accountable. I mean, it's just as simple as that. Look, I can take you through Trump first term, Trump second term, and anytime you tell him, look, the Russians did this, even if he didn't know about it, he's like, oh, no, this can't possibly be true. Now, I hate to bring up old history, but whenever you had evidence, and it's rock solid evidence, that the Russians interfered in the 2016 election, Trump would say, oh, that's stupid. That's ridiculous. It's probably just some fat guy, some 400-pound guy sitting on his, on his laptop in his bedroom who's putting out these tweets and putting out this information on Facebook. It's like, no, it's not, man. It's the Russians who are doing it. When it was a question of the Russians possibly interfering in Afghanistan, if not necessarily paying a bounty for American soldiers to get killed, at least having contacts with the Taliban. He's like, oh, no, this can't be the case as well. No, if it was the Russians carrying out political warfare in Europe, cyber warfare, or trying to intervene in European elections, the problem's elsewhere. It's just what Trump does. And it does start, with he does have an affection for Vladimir Putin. And he does believe Putin when Putin says nice things to him. And he has an advisor named Steve Witkoff, who is effectively in Putin's pocket. Look, when Steve Witkoff the real estate developer and supposed envoy, says in an interview, and he said this, what, 3 weeks ago, Vladimir Putin is candid and honest with me. Vladimir Putin, candid and honest, the guy who invaded another country, the guy who has tried to destabilize Europe, destabilize the US, and he's candid and honest with you. Well, if Steve Witkoff tells that to Trump, Trump goes, oh, I guess everything's okay with Vlad. And so that's why he gets irritated. He just doesn't want to be accountable.
From your perspective, what are the main reasons behind this special relationship and friendship between Steve Witkoff, Trump, and Russian dictator Vladimir Putin?
I mean, with Trump, because I'm working on the book on Trump, I've got quite a bit on this, and Trump, first of all, had this idea that he always wanted to make it big in Russia. He always wanted to have the big property development in Russia. And this goes back in particular to the 1990s when he was first talking about Trump Tower in Moscow. And his kids went out there. Ivanka went out there. I think it was with either Don Jr. or Eric. And they get this grand tour of Moscow, and Ivanka even sits in Vladimir Putin's chair in the Kremlin. Obviously Vladimir was away at the time. But then it continues into the 2000s, and Trump still has this idea, yeah, I can get this Trump Tower built. Now, it never gets built because Russia is a hard country to do business in, and he can never get to the right people to get it built. But in 2013, he wants to meet Putin face to face. He really wants to meet this guy. And so he's like, okay, I'll take the Miss Universe pageant to Moscow. Trump had the rights for it, television rights for it. And so he literally takes the Miss Universe pageant to Moscow, hoping to meet Putin. Putin can't meet him in the end, but he sends him a very nice gift with a little handwritten note. And Trump's absolutely, God, this guy wrote me. He's like, okay. Trump, in other words, is a fanboy of Vladimir Putin. He is like a fanboy. He just has this great admiration for Putin. And of course, the Russians play on that in 2016. By collaborating with the Trump camp, numerous contacts, feeding them the hacked emails that they stole from the Democrats. And so Trump is also got to be indebted to Putin for that. And you still see it in 2026 when, despite all the evidence that you and I talk about the Russians don't want a ceasefire, they don't want to stop the invasion, they don't want to give up on the idea that they'll seize all of the Donbass in the east of Ukraine. Trump comes out and says, oh, it's Zelensky who's the barrier to the agreement, and it's Putin who's the one who really wants to settle. In terms of Witkoff, he's just naive. I honestly don't know. He's an old friend of Donald Trump from the 80s. And he obviously has made a lot of money in terms of real estate development. And I honestly don't see how he could have done that, because he is just hopelessly naive with the Russians. So the Russians profiled him. They profiled all the Trump people when Trump got back into the White House in January. And they said, we don't want Keith Kellogg, the general and the foreign policy specialist. We don't want him to be the envoy for Ukraine and Russia, or at least for Russia. We want Witkoff, because they thought Witkoff could be manipulated. And they were absolutely right. The first time that Witkoff went out to Russia, I think it was around early April 2025, and Kirill Dmitriev, who's Vladimir Putin's top financial guy, but he's also a guy who has worked with the Trump folks since at least 2017, January 2017. He's the escort for Witkoff. He shows them all around St. Petersburg, all the different manufacturing plants, the different high-tech plants. And he's telling Witkoff, we could have great projects together. We could have wonderful projects together. And I think that did it with Witkoff. It was like, this idea is we can make money here. Real estate developer Witkoff now becomes like high profile global player, Steve Witkoff, with these US-Russian projects. And you can track all the way from April, all the way till the ultimatum at the end of October 2025, when Dmitriev works with Witkoff and Jared Kushner on this ultimatum to Ukraine and says to Kushner, Witkoff, if you get Ukraine to accept this, we could have these major US-Russian economic projects. which President Zelensky says, $12 trillion. That's what the Russians are offering Witkoff. And Witkoff simply sees the dollars or the rubles in front of him and doesn't really think about the geopolitics.
There have been really many discussions and debates, rumors about whether Trump being a Russian asset. Is President Trump a Russian asset? What is your take on this?
Well, sometimes you have to be precise when you talk about the terms in terms of, assets versus agents, right? And an operative is someone who is an intelligence officer, right? So Russian operatives will look for agents. Those are people, they might be American, they might be European, there have been some in Ukraine who will work for the Russian services. Now, sometimes these agents get paid. In fact, quite often they get paid for these services. Sometimes the agents want a favor in return from the Russians. An asset's different. An asset is not someone who actually knows that he or she is an agent for the Russians. You can be an asset. You can be useful to the Russians without knowing it. So back in the late 1970s, the Czech services, and of course, Czechoslovakia was at that point part of the Soviet sphere of influence. The Czech services start to try to build up contacts around Trump. And Trump's first wife is from that part of the world. And so the KGB by the 1980s jumps in, and they've got a field officer in the United States who is trying to get close to Trump. And indeed, he actually has meetings face-to-face with Trump and talks to him and says, "Oh, you're a great businessman, Donald." And Trump thinks, he's dealing with someone from the Soviet embassy or Soviet consulate and says, "Oh, okay, well, you're lovely as well." And that's the case. And the Soviets and then the Russians keep working this. They keep people who make contact with Trump or with his inner circle. And Trump is useful to them certainly from the late 1980s, because from the late 1980s, Trump, for his own motives, is going, "Oh, the U.S. really needs to pull out of NATO, or at least limit its involvement in NATO. It needs to demand money from Germany. It needs to demand money from Japan. It needs to demand money from Europe in general. It needs to limit its links." So Trump's being this destabilizing influence. Then, of course, the Soviet Union falls. But throughout the 1990s, the Russians have still got their eyes on him. And by the time you get to the early 21st century, when Trump's in a great deal of financial trouble, and the Russians look at it, and Trump's got this property down in Florida. And this property, I think Trump had bought it for around about $45 million. And it's filled with mold. It's not in very good shape, but all of a sudden, this Russian businessman pops up and says, "I'll pay you $95 million for it." And Trump says, "Wow, hey, you got money here," right? At a time when he's strapped for cash. And the Russians, again, were laundering money with that purchase, but also, tick, tick, they get more credit in Trump's mind. And as I said, when it even comes to the point where Trump gets this handwritten note from Putin in 2013, the Russians are simply playing on the guy. He could be useful to us. And of course, then he chooses to run for president in 2015. And now the Russians have hit the jackpot. Because when the guy gets into office, he will do what we want him to do without him knowing that this is exactly what we want. And all I can tell you is if you want to know what the definition of a Russian asset is, in May of 2017, Donald Trump fires the FBI director, James Comey, because Comey refuses to pledge loyalty to Trump and refuses to say there will be no investigation of Russia's interference in the 2016 election. So Trump fires him. He then goes into a White House meeting room where the Russian ambassador, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, and the Russian ambassador to the U.S. are there. And Trump says, "Hey, I just fired that nutcase, James Comey, just fired that nutcase," right? So he's bragging about firing a U.S. official, the head of the FBI, to the Russians. He then, in the course of that meeting with the Russians, gives them vital intelligence about U.S. operations in Syria. After that, when he is at his first summit with Vladimir Putin in Helsinki in 2018, so this is the first one-on-one summit, he stands up, and when asked to choose between the U.S. intelligence services and Vladimir Putin, he chooses Putin. That's the definition of an asset. The Russians did not need to pay Donald Trump any money. They did not, at least directly. They did not need to directly say to him, will you work for us? They manipulated him, and they still try to manipulate him.
From your perspective, could something change in the nearest future in case of collapse of this US-led negotiations to end the war in Ukraine, which have apparently stalled?
Yeah, I mean, the question here is that we just don't know what could happen here. You know, we've always known that it was unlikely that we were going to get a ceasefire out of this. I think despite what President Zelensky and President Zelensky's staff, you know, Mr. Budnov, the foreign minister, Mr. Spia, you know, the defense minister, Mr. Fedorov, despite what they say, I think, you know, about, oh, we're glad the Americans are doing this. We hope we make progress. I think they know they aren't going to get a ceasefire. You know, why you go through these political talks with the Russians is you try to get the political and diplomatic advantage in what will be an ongoing invasion. And that is, you try to maintain European support because you show the Europeans, look, you know, we're going to work with you on this. You show to those people in the Trump administration who actually believe in European security, yes, it's worth defending Ukraine. And you show the world that, you know, we're still defending against an aggressor here, and it's that aggressor that refuses to stop, you know, and this is the part of politics of war that takes place. Because, and again, I think you and I have discussed this before, Daniel, you just simply have to outlast the Russians here. You know, I still think that, you know, the ceasefire doesn't come about because of a military breakthrough. The ceasefire doesn't come about because of sudden, you know, big negotiated settlement. The ceasefire comes about because the Russians just exhaust themselves. They just economically, they just can't keep grinding it out. And at that point, they finally accept, you know, look, they can occupy the areas of Russia that they hold, occupy the areas of Ukraine that they hold, but they don't get any more territory, you know. And at that point, they accept that Ukraine's going to get some security guarantees, hopefully some lasting security guarantees. The Russians had to accept Sweden and Finland becoming part of NATO. They've had to accept that Central and Eastern Europe are much firmer in terms of their security position, whether it's the Baltic states, whether it's Poland. Russia's had to accept that economically it's not in the greatest of positions, to say the least. When do they finally accept? When does the Kremlin finally accept that you're not going to conquer Ukraine? You know, they're not there yet. You just have to hope that 6 months from now they might be.
Let's also cover the Middle East. How close are we to any possible endgame in the Middle East, in this war, US-Israeli war against Iran?
Yeah, I've got a lot of I don't knows for you. I know an analyst isn't supposed to say I don't know, but, you know, we're 10 days into this and the attacks are expanding. They're expanding because the US and Israel could not succeed with their plan A. Plan A was collapse the regime, whether it was regime change, the Israeli goal, whether it was regime surrender, the American goal. You collapse the regime because you kill the supreme leader, you kill their top officials. But the regime didn't give up, and instead it launched these retaliations that expanded the war across the Middle East. And that's where we are 10 days later. Indeed, we've gone beyond that because the US and Israel are now expanding their attacks on civilian targets and on Iran infrastructure. They're behaving a lot. You know, I'm not saying they're exactly like the Kremlin, heaven forbid, but in terms of their tactics, they're behaving a lot like the Russians. And that is, we just simply bomb oil facilities, which is what they did over the weekend when the Israelis bombed at least 5 oil facilities in or near Tehran. You bomb other energy facilities. You bomb transport facilities. You just try to completely break the country in its ability to operate. Again, that still hasn't made the regime surrender. I don't think it will. And if anything, I think it means that even more Iranians, as much as they might despise the regime, are thinking, well, we can't support what the US and Israel are doing because they're destroying our country. So if we don't know how long it's going to last, where do we think it could wind up? I think and I think I mentioned this to you and Sophia last week. I think the only countries that have leverage that could try to stop this right now are the Gulf states. And Qatar is trying to do this. The Emir of Qatar spoke with Donald Trump by phone over the weekend, but it still doesn't appear that Qatar has been able to budge the Americans. It doesn't appear the Saudis have been able to budge the Americans. So that means this continues until I think the Trump breaking point will be the effect of the surge in energy prices. As I speak to you, the global oil price this morning had gone up as high as $118 per barrel. That was from a position of the low 60s on February 28th. So it had gone up by about 80 to 90% within 10 days. Now it's back down to around 108, 109, because there might be some release of oil from strategic reserves, but that's still an increase of around 70%. And that's having an effect, therefore, on gasoline prices across the world, but including in the United States. And Americans are always concerned about gasoline prices. And the Trump camp had been saying, look, we reduced gasoline prices last year. Well, they can't say that anymore. And now, in fact, gas prices are going to go beyond where they were during the Biden years. Electricity prices are going to go up. Food prices are going to go up because you have to transport food, and the cost of transport goes up. Manufacturing costs go up. You're going to have a spike of inflation, and you're going to see a slowdown in the American economy on top of the problems that the American economy already had. So unless the regime surrenders in the next few days, next few weeks, the Trump folks are going to be losing domestic support. And when they lose domestic support, that's when their vital interests are at stake, because it means they don't get Republicans reelected in November. It means their own future in terms of leadership is curbed. But not there yet. I mean, Trump's still tweeting unconditional surrender. He's still saying like he should have a choice in Iran's next supreme leader, something that the Iranians defied because the new supreme leader was in fact chosen yesterday. He's the son of the old supreme leader, Mujtaba Khamenei. So what I would tell you as a clue, Daniel, is that yesterday, Trump officials were at great pains to say, oh, this is only going to last weeks. It won't last months. Everything will be fine. This rise in gas prices is short term. And Donald Trump said overnight, tweeted overnight in all caps, short-term prices will go up, but it's worth it to get rid of this evil regime. Anybody who doesn't support this is a fool. When he has to tweet that, he's worried. So let's come back, and maybe by the time we talk next Monday, maybe there'll be a glimmer that the Gulf states can go to the Trump folks and say, look, this isn't helping your economy. This isn't helping our economies. This isn't helping the world's economy. You need to ceasefire, and you need to get the Israelis to stop attacks as well.
As they have been mentioning, it's a short loss for a long-term gain, right?
Well, yeah, but where's your long-term game, Daniel? I mean, look, this is what the Kremlin said. This is what the Kremlin has said for 4 years, right? Oh, it's a short-term loss, 1.4 million casualties. It's a short-term loss, but it's a long-term gain for Greater Russia. Well, good luck with that, Vlad. Where's your Greater Russia right now? Well, in this case, it's like, okay, short-term loss for long-term gain. Even if the regime surrenders, or actually, even if the regime collapses, where are you then? Where are you? Okay, they're out of power, but Iran has been literally destroyed in terms of its infrastructure. It means all its services are shattered. you don't have an organized opposition that they can just step in and take power. So you're going to get fragmentations. You're going to have different groups fighting each other. Iran is fairly unified in terms of religion. It's 95% Shia, but you have Kurds, you have Azeris, you have Arabs, you have Baluchs in the southeast of the country. They all have different goals. And I don't want to think Iraq 2003, but yeah, Iraq 2003. You got rid of the bad guys. You got rid of them, but then you didn't bring stability. That's not what happened. And that's the risk that you run here with the way that this operation is going, because they haven't planned for this politically. All they know, all the Trump folks know is kill people, blow up stuff. That's all they know. And if you haven't planned for this politically and worked it out, you're just hoping that something can come out of this. And hope is not enough here. You actually have to have a realistic approach for the so-called long term. So short-term loss probably means long-term instability. And is that really what your legacy to be?
Thank you, Professor Lucas, for your time and for your another insightful conversation, and glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you to all Ukrainians.